Every year towards the end of the school year, I get invited into our pre-K classroom, and I love to go. They bring me in to talk about all the tough questions the teachers don't want to answer, usually about God. And so the questions that I typically field, here they are, just a sampling. Is God a boy or a girl? Does God live in heaven? Does God eat or sleep? Is God real? How many of you have had to field one of those questions from a child or a grandchild? None of you? How many of you were asked? Raise your hand. How many of you didn't answer the question? Raise your hand. How many of you sent them to me? Raise your hand. That's more like it. So I try and lay a theological foundation for these 5-year-olds. So my answer usually follows something like this. God is different from anything else we know. God is not a boy or a girl because God doesn't have a body. Therefore, God doesn't need a house to live in or a bed to sleep in. Therefore, heaven's really not a real place, just what we call when God is all around. And God is necessary, and food is necessary for us because we have bodies. But since God doesn't have a body, he doesn't eat Cheerios or anything else. These questions are generated by the students through the teachers, and often the teacher will have to ask them the questions for the students because they get all shy. They'll always chime in, by the way. So if I say that God is not a human or an animal or a plant, they'll always say, I have a cat. No, I have 3 dogs. I have like these 5-year-olds. It's like they're all over the place. One boy raised a hand and wanted a follow-up question, and the follow-up question was, does God go to the bathroom? And after everything I'd been through in terms of my explanation, you would have thought it would have been clear. But it's so hard to understand those big questions. I guess I'm glad that he actually didn't ask, does God go to the bathroom standing up or sitting down? I guess that would have been a whole, because I talk about God not being boy or girl or having gender at all. It's a great story about Isidore Rabbi, Jewish Nobel laureate. In physics, who passed away 30 years ago. He was once asked, why did you become a scientist rather than a doctor, lawyer, or businessman like all of the other immigrant children in your neighborhood? Dr. Rabi's answer was profound. What he said was, my mother made me a scientist. It's okay, she's good. You got a question about God? I'll take it right now if you want. Feel free if she wants to play over there, whatever, she's good, not to worry. So Rabbi responsored. Every other Jewish mother in Brooklyn would ask her child after school, so, did you learn anything today? But not my mother. She always asked me a different question. Izzy, she'd say, Izzy, did you ask a good question today? Did you ask a good question? That difference, Dr. Ravi said, asking good questions made me become a scientist. So why am I talking about big questions today? I have to tell you, it's because of you all. Rabbi Goldstein and I recently, a number of months ago, were trying to figure out what we could offer for adult education that would bring people in who currently aren't coming in for classes or to engage in discussions. And we would ask people, one after another, people would respond, want to talk about the big questions. That's what they wanted to deal with. And as a result, we created a class, I'll talk about that in a moment, and began to think about a sermon as well about what does it mean to ask the big questions and what does it mean to ask a question in general. Like Judaism is clearly motivated by questions. Humans are motivated by questions, but have we lost that ability to ask? I believe, by the way, that the Torah itself is the first Jewish book of why. And I believe that. Written to answer the greatest questions that we had in the form of a narrative and divine inspiration. Questions have always been at the center of Jewish identity and Judaism. And today, aren't you supposed to be asking the big questions about you, about life? Before we get on to the big questions, I want to explore the role of questions in general. Every good educator knows that the role of a teacher is not to give facts, but rather to inspire questions. That's the role of a teacher. It's easy to give facts out to somebody, much harder to inspire them to ask questions. Socrates knew this when he taught, "Wonder is the beginning of learning," he said. In the words of Einstein, the important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing. During our lifetime, we're presented with lots of facts. We may even read lots of books. You may be one of those people that can just remember everything. But those little pieces of data that you have, according to the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, are simply inert ideas. What that means is without a context and connection, those facts that you know are meaningless. They must relate to something in life. And that's where questions come in. And I don't know about you, but unfortunately from my personal experience and observations, it appears that far fewer people today are asking questions than ever before. Either they think they have the answers, or they just don't want to look ignorant by asking somebody else. Some people learned in school a long time ago that if you ask questions, it only gets you in trouble. Think back to when you're in high school and college, you never wanted to challenge a teacher too much because you're afraid they would lower your grade. What does that do to inspire learning? Not so long ago, what did you do if you wanted to find out information? You'd pull out your world book. Remember that? How many remember your world book? By the way, kids, it's actually a real book. You couldn't get it on a Kindle then. And you actually look up facts and you would try to learn something, but often that long, long article didn't help you to get the answers. And then we were lucky enough years ago to be able to look it up online, to do a search and to ask for information, and you could get the answers. And today, how do you get your answers today, many of you? You just ask Alexa or Siri. Isn't that true? So a month ago, as I was working on this sermon, I turned to Alexa and I asked her, "Alexa, what's the meaning of life?" To which she very quickly, definitively just responded, 42. Now, I was impressed that Alexa had read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where 42 is the number that he came up with in terms of some mystical tradition of the meaning of the universe. But I wanted to know what she really thought, so I asked her again, "Alexa, what's the meaning of life?" She responded, "The traditional answer is 42. I thought, well, she really bought into this. Let me try one more time and push my luck. I asked again, and this time she answered, "The answer is 42, but the question is much more complicated." So last week, as I was continuing to work on the sermon, I asked her again. I wanted to see what she had learned in the last month. And so I asked her the meaning of life, and she responded, "The meaning of life depends upon the life in question, but a good approximation is 42. And then when I asked a second time, this time, she gave me a beautiful quote from Eleanor Roosevelt that had to do with the meaning of life. So I believe, by the way, that the programmers of Alexa and Siri understand when they program Alexa that these questions are not questions that she can answer. And so where normally Alexa will look online to find your answer and even ask you, isn't it true, whether you're satisfied with that answer or not? She didn't ask me this time. Because I think the programmers know that these big questions are not things that just machines can tell us. And by the way, as long as we're dealing with the big issues of life, why not respond with a little bit of humor? And so Alexa and Siri really are there to serve a different purpose, because there's no answer with a capital A when it comes to the big questions. For a number of the people I encounter, a lack of interest in exploring the big questions is related to the inability to come up with empirical answers. I've had this discussion with people. They ask, right, after a while, why should I get a headache if I can't come up with the answer? Right? Over and over, you can discuss back and forth without an answer. Humans so often just want the answer, and that's not possible with the big questions. In the Jewish tradition, questions and hence learning are always considered in relationship to other people. If you've ever studied in a traditional context, a yeshiva, or in rabbinical school, you always study in what we call chavruta. Chavruta is an Aramaic word related to the Hebrew word haver, which many of you know means friend. So you study with a friend. The Talmud says, it's a beautiful quote, 2 scholars sharpen one another. Isn't that beautiful? When people come together in dialogue, they help each other learn in a way that a book, even a great book like the Talmud, cannot help you with. In fact, for many generations, by the way, in the Talmudic period, there were always a sense of, there were pairs of scholars. And these 2 leading voices in their generation, going back to the 3rd and 4th centuries, these enormous presences, they had different attitudes about Jewish life. They had different answers about what to do. And in fact, in one discussion about who was right, the famous rabbis of Hillel and Shammai, they're arguing back and forth, and finally a voice from heaven comes out and says, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim. Both of them are the words of a living God. Isn't that amazing? That you can have contradictory opinions and both be the words of God. I think she wants you to go with her. It's okay. You lasted a long time. There are other people who got their eyes closed already, so don't worry. You did well. It's time for their nap and time for your nap. But this is the nature of big questions. There are multiple answers. The big question really is, which answer speaks to you? That's what it's all about. Which one resonates with you? Which one brings life to your meaning? For the big questions of life, we can't turn to Alexa and Siri. We turn to our fellow travelers of life. You have to turn to one another to be able to ask those questions. The first big question of all time, by the way, is asked by God. Remember this story, Adam and Eve put in the garden, not supposed to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. They eat of the tree and then they hide. And God calls out, Ayeka, where are you? Now, come on. Didn't God know where they were? I mean, isn't that your assumption when you read the Bible, is that God knows it all? That's certainly 2 little humans hiding. And so why did God ask that question? Where are you? According to the famous commentator Rashi, God knew where they were, but he posed the question in order to engage them in a dialogue. But I want you to think about for a moment, if you've never thought about this before, why did they hide? Now you're probably thinking, as most people do, they thought they had violated God's law and so they hid. But I want you to think about the text as it goes on. So God calls out, where are you? Adam responds to God's question by saying, I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. Rather than condemning him, God comes up with 2 more questions. First of all, he asks, who told you you were naked? And then, did you eat of the tree which I had forbidden you to eat? And Adam can't answer the questions. Instead, you know this part, he blames Eve. Eve blames the serpent. And nothing has changed in life because we blame everybody else. But notice, Adam didn't answer the question. Because really what you think about, how did he really know he was naked? if no one told him? He didn't even understand it. I want to suggest that this first learning experience, Adam had no idea what to do with. He had learned, but didn't know what that meant. And how did he learn, and how did it all begin? With questions. And the question, where are you, is just not a simple question. I don't want you to think about how the Bible would portray it, like, where are you? I want you to put it back into the 70s a little bit and to hear it like this. Hey, where are you, man? It's not a question of location, about where you are physically, but it's where you are spiritually. It's where you are in your evolution and your growth as a human being. That's what that question means. Where are you? And we have to think about those big questions. The first big question, where are you, is part of these high holy days. Haven't you been asking yourselves that question, I hope? Where are you? Where have you been? Where are you going? These are the big questions we should be asking. If you want to think about Jewish tradition and questions, what holiday do you think about when it comes to questions? Passover. And the 4 questions, of course. The Mishnah says, one of the oldest books we have, part of the Talmud, back to the 2nd century, says this: you pour him a cup of wine, and then the child asks the father. And if the child doesn't know how to ask the father, doesn't know what to ask, then the text gives us this. Why is this night different than any other night? We put in the mouth of questions to the children so that they understand what it means to ask questions. Why do we eat matzah on this night? And why do we dip twice? It's not just about why we do these things, but it really is about, what does this experience mean? What are you going to do for it? And I want to suggest, by the way, if your seders are just about the dipping in the matzah, and we don't understand why, if you don't understand the deep connection about freedom and about the call to change the world, then those rituals and those questions are lost on you. If you've ever wondered how tradition teaches values, you look no further than our Jewish tradition in asking questions. To tell the story of the Exodus at Passover is a mitzvah. To do it by a Socratic method, that's genius. That's the Jewish genius of how you convey knowledge and learn. We generally view a why or what question as one of the big questions of life. Like, what is the meaning of life? What happens after we die? Why is this happening to me? There's just some examples. I want you to take a moment, just think in your head, one big question that you want to ask. Just think for a moment. So what word did it begin with? How many of you, that question in your head, how many of them began with why? Raise your hand if your question, raise a high, the questions, your hands. All right. How many of you was it what? Raise your hands nice and high. How many of you was how? All right. I want you to understand that the why, the what, the when, it's really the how questions that matter. When you ask the how question, you transform a theoretical question of when, why, and what into a practical, relevant question. Right? How do I live a life of meaning? How do I find appreciation in my everyday experience? How will I make a difference in this world? How do we recapture civility in our society? Those are the big questions. The use of the word how changes it all. When I was speaking with my friend Rabbi Naomi Levy about the sermon a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about questions and asking, and she said, people always ask why. They ask the why questions. I try to ask back of those who come to me with their questions. I ask them, is it how? How can I live the most meaningful and fulfilling life in the face of all the whys that will never be answered? Isn't that a beautiful response? How are we going to live? The other very important fact to know about the big questions of life is that at different stages, we're going to ask different questions. And sometimes the same question at different stages is going to give us different answers. Isn't that true? Like, ask yourself the question, what is the meaning of life? And a 30-year-old is going to answer that very differently than a 80-year-old. And how do you measure success? Going to answer that very differently. And so from Shakespeare to Erickson to Gail Sheehy, they all talk about that we have different stages of life. And so what happens is in the big questions is we're supposed to figure out what are the new questions of that life period. And we ask the same questions and we figure out what the new answers are for our period of life. So here's your question. I imagine that some of you ask yourself these big questions. But do you really engage in dialogues with other people about them? My experience with people is no. You see, most people will sit around a table with a candelabra, sit around that table, and they'll just catch up on family. They'll talk about the experiences they've had. They'll gossip. But how often do they really ask and talk about the big questions of life? I don't find that happening a lot. And I want you to take from this is your need to do that. That's what life is about, is to open up those big questions. They're designed to share with other people, not just for self-reflection. Judaism knows that. That's why they want you to find a chavruta. They want you to find a partner, someone to talk to about it. And so I want you to find a chavruta partner if you don't have one in life. It doesn't always mean a spouse, by the way. Sometimes it's other people that you have these discussions with. Each person in our life fulfills different areas. So to find a chavruta partner. Rabbi Goldstein and I will be running this month, starting next month, monthly program on the big questions. Some of you on Rosh Hashanah saw these. They're around today. This beautiful, amazing book, little book of big questions created by our very creative communications director, Ben Vorspan, which has the topics of the discussions we're going to be doing on a monthly basis. And then an area for journal writing. Just to put down your thoughts if you come or if you're reading or sharing with someone else. And the latter part of the book, if you'll notice, doesn't have questions. Because I want you to come up with your questions. I want you to think about and to articulate what are the big questions that you need to think about in life. Big questions, talking with people, thinking about what life is about. I want to conclude with a final story. So more than 20 years ago, probably closer to 25 years ago, a random caller called and left a message on my voicemail. And the message read as follows, right? So here's how I heard it. My name is John. I'm a Catholic, but someone said Judaism might be a better fit for me. What can you tell me about it? When I called John back, I asked him to tell me his story and why he didn't think that Catholicism answered the questions for him. And then I responded, I said, I have bad news for you. We don't have the answer. I paused, I laughed a little bit, and I added, oh, look, don't get me wrong, we have answers, more than you can count, but we don't have the answer. On the other hand, if you're looking for a place where you can ask life's most profound, difficult, and meaningful questions, and be willing to accept the responses you get, and then to do a bit more studying, thinking, and talking about them with others to formulate new questions, if that's what you had in mind, if that is a way of living, then maybe you can find a place with us. You think I turned him off? John began his studies for Judaism, and he converted to Judaism. That's not the end of the story, because John went on to rabbinical school and became a rabbi. John Kreitz Borak, who was here many years ago, some of you may remember him as a rabbinic intern. And John loves to tell this story. He tells it in part because he talks about the importance of returning a phone call. What you don't know is that John made 5 identical phone calls to rabbis and left that same message, and I was the only one to call him back. He tells it also, the story, because it speaks of truth. That questions are what life is about. That questions are what will bring us meaning. It's not the answers, ladies and gentlemen. It's the questions. If you stop asking questions, you stop living. If you think you know the answers, you have stopped living. Living is continually asking the questions over and over and sharing with other people and learning from other people. And today of all days is a day in which you're supposed to be asking those questions. Today we focus on death, mortality. If today were the last day, how would you feel about your life? If that's not a big question, I don't know what is. So for all of you, I want this to be a year of big questions and great discussions. May one question lead to 10 more, thereby provide a quest of questions, a journey of meaning. Gemar Chatima Tova, may you be inscribed for a year of questions and meaning, and let us all say, Amen.